Hello, everyone, and welcome to my Bible study on the book of James. We're going to break this book down by verses and do an in-depth study on this great book of the Bible. The first couple lessons will be on the introduction to the book of James, and then we will dive right into the scriptures. So let's just get started with the introduction to the book of James. Few books of the Bible have been more criticized than the book of James. Controversy has waged over its authorship, its date, its recipients, its canonicy, and its unity. It is well known that Martin Luther had problems with this book. He saw it as disagreeing with Paul's epistles. But what Martin Luther did not understand was that Paul emphasized the priority of faith versus law by means of righteousness. And James emphasized the proof of faith in one's life. You know, sometimes believers devalue James by emphasizes on what James could have done better in his ministry. But we must be very careful about placing too much emphasis on what some people claim James could have done better in his ministry. Let me just say that again. We must be very careful about placing too much emphasis on what some people claim James could have done better in his ministry, or otherwise we will miss out on the truth that God intends to teach us through this book. And that goes for any book of the Bible for that matter. James is considered one of the general epistles. James, like the epistle of Peter, John, and Jude, is a encyclical letter, in other words, a circulating letter, addressed not to individual churches or persons, but to a larger sphere of believers. The teaching in these general letters complements the doctrine of Paul. Paul emphasized faith, James stressed conduct, Peter hope, John love, and Jude purity. The authorship, it seems clear, therefore, that the author is James, the earthly brother of the Lord, who became the recognized pastor of the Jerusalem church. This conclusion is supported by the authoritative tone of the letter and by the marked similarities in Greek between this epistle and the speech by James recorded in Acts chapter 15. Furthermore, many early writers, including Augustine, support the view that James is the author. The New Testament mentions at least four men named James. Number one, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John, Mark 1 and 19. Number two, the son of Alphaeus, Mark chapter 3, verse 18. Number three, the father of Judas, not Iscariot, Luke 6 and 16. And number four, the earthly brother of the Lord, Galatians 1 and 19. Jesus had four earthly brothers and at least two sisters. Since James is mentioned first, he is probably the second oldest. The first oldest between Mary and Joseph, Matthew 13 and 55 and 56, and Mark 6 and 3. Repeated references are made to the Lord's earthly brothers and sisters. Four of his brothers are named James, Joseph, Simon, and Jude, Matthew 13 and 55. And Jude is the same man that wrote the book of Jude. James's conversion. Though James was reared in the same home with the Lord Jesus, he did not become a believer until after Christ's resurrection. John wrote, for even his own brothers did not believe in him, John 7 and 5. His brothers therefore said to him, depart from here and go into Judah, that your disciples may see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret, while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world, for even his brothers did not believe in him. James's encounter with the risen Lord would have brought him to saving faith. Number one, Christ appeared to James and then to all the apostles, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 7. Number two, after that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles, The way Paul makes this statement, it was as if Jesus appeared to James first and then to the rest of the apostles. This is not seen in any of the Gospels, but if this is true, it would have been handed down through James and the apostles themselves. James, along with Mary and the other brothers, were waiting, praying, praising in the upper room in Jerusalem. And James was one of the 120 plus that was filled with the Spirit on the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 1, verse 14. James' apostleship and position as pastor of the church in Jerusalem. It is believed that the reason why Jesus appeared to James first, if indeed he appeared to James first, was to appoint him as pastor of the church in Jerusalem. Others believe that since James was the closest brother to Jesus, he was chosen as the pastor. James was the senior pastor of the church in Jerusalem from its beginning in about 30 AD until he was martyred by Ananias, the high priest, in 62 AD. The Jerusalem church was the first church to exist, made up mainly of Jews. It consisted of about 20 to 40,000 people. It had no church building, which meant that they met mainly in houses, but also met in open fields, rented buildings, caves, under trees, etc. The fact that he was pastor of this church was huge. It was one of the most influential positions in the early church. Paul called him a pillars in the church, Galatians 2 and 9. Tradition refers to James as James the Just and James the Camel-kneed, which was not a sarcastic term, but a compliment to his consecration to Christ. And James's reputation was very much like Christ. The religious leaders hated him, but the common people loved him. Mark 12 and 37. Josephus states that James was martyred by Ananias the high priest in 62 AD. Ananias brought James before the Sanhedrin on the accusations of being a lawbreaker and then had him stoned. The Romans were in transition from one Roman governor to another, and Ananias viewed this as an opportunity to have James killed and not have any Roman interference. Another Jewish historian claimed that James was thrown off the pinnacle of the temple. James did not die from the fall, so it was said that he was hit in the head with a large stone that killed him. The recipients of this letter, it is stated that the epistle is addressed to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad across the Roman Empire, James 1 and 1. The expression, the 12 tribes, is clearly Jewish and no doubt was intended to identify the readers as Jewish Christians. Some have suggested that they were believers who were forced to leave Jerusalem during the persecution that followed Stephen's death at approximately 35 AD. These Jewish Christians spread out over Judah and Samaria, Acts chapter 8, verse 1, and even as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Syrian Antioch, Acts chapter 11, verse 19. It is most reasonable to assume that James, the leading pastor of the Jerusalem church, would feel responsible for these brethren and would attempt to instruct them somewhat as he would have done while they still was under his care in Jerusalem. The epistle reveals his intimate knowledge of their circumstances and characterizes as he writes with a note of authority expected of one who has been recognized as a spiritual leader in the Jerusalem church. And we will go ahead and stop there. That will be the end of the first part of the introduction. and we will pick back up on our next lesson starting with a date of the book was written. And that concludes my lesson on the first part of the introduction, and God bless.